You walked into the house with a heart full of hope, only to realize that years of sacrifice seemed invisible to your own family. In that moment, the joy you had been waiting for turned into a deep crack inside, leaving an unanswered question. How could those closest to you treat you this way? Behind the laughter and the cheerful gathering lies a bitter truth no one dares to admit. Slowly, a story begins to unfold, one you simply cannot look away from. If you've ever felt forgotten, you will understand this deeply. Stay with me, and if this story touches your heart, a gentle like and subscribe will be a precious way to walk this journey together. You remember the day as if it were painted in slow motion, each detail etched into your mind with unsettling clarity. The walls of the house were warm with golden light, the sound of conversation drifting through the rooms, yet for you, the air carried a heaviness that no one else seemed to feel. You had come prepared, carrying not just a gift in your hands, but a heart full of longing, hoping that, for once, your effort would be seen. It wasn't about grandeur or wealth, it was about love, about finally being acknowledged. But from the very first step inside, something felt off. Smiles that should have welcomed you appeared faint, distracted, as if you were merely another face in the crowd. The people you had grown up with, the ones whose laughter once echoed with yours in childhood, barely looked your way. You carried on, forcing a smile, reminding yourself that tonight wasn't about being noticed. Tonight was about your family, about celebrating someone you loved. You placed the carefully chosen gift on the table, your hands trembling just slightly. It wasn't the price of the gift that mattered, it was the memories stitched into it, the quiet nights spent preparing it, the tears that had stained your notebook as you wrote words from the heart. You wanted nothing more than to bring joy to someone who had once been your hero. But as voices grew louder around you, a quiet doubt began whispering. Would anyone even care? The room buzzed with energy, yet you felt strangely apart from it. Cousins chatted about their jobs, aunts compared recipes, siblings exchanged inside jokes that excluded you. You laughed softly when prompted, nodding at stories, but inside, you carried a loneliness that pressed heavier with every passing moment. That night was meant to be a celebration, but to you, it became a mirror reflecting years of being overlooked. And then, the moment came that would stay with you forever. Your gift, the very symbol of your devotion, was brushed aside as though it were nothing. A careless hand, a dismissive glance, it was as if your heart had been placed on trial and judged unworthy in a single instant. You froze, waiting for anyone to step forward and defend you. But the silence was deafening. A few chuckles even rose from the corners of the room, sharp enough to pierce through your chest like glass shards. You wanted to believe it was an accident, that no harm was intended. Yet the sneer you called from across the room told you otherwise. In that one look, you saw years of rivalry, bitterness, and unspoken resentment laid bare. You realized this wasn't a one-time mistake, it was part of a pattern, a thread woven into the very fabric of how your family treated you. Still, you swallowed your pain. You stood tall, your face calm, though inside your heart quaked like a fragile vase about to shatter. You had been here before, moments when your presence felt like an afterthought, when your voice was drowned out by louder ones, when your achievements were met with silence while others were celebrated. This night was only the most visible proof of a truth you had long tried to deny. And in that denial, you had built walls around yourself. You had learned to hide your tears in quiet corners, to whisper your victories only to yourself, to turn pain into silent strength. But even the strongest walls can crack under enough weight, and tonight, as laughter echoed in a room that should have felt like home, you felt those cracks widening. Do you know that feeling, the one where you stand among the people you've known your whole life, yet feel utterly invisible? Where love is supposed to be unconditional, yet somehow, you are left earning it again and again. If you've ever been there, then you understand the ache that never really leaves. Fact number 7 really shocked me. What about you? What made the sting sharper was the way others dismissed it so quickly. Don't make a fuss, close quote, they said, their words brushing off your hurt as though it were a fleeting annoyance. They didn't realize, or perhaps they didn't care, that behind your quiet exterior was a heart that had been breaking for years. You weren't asking for perfection, you were asking to be seen, to be valued, to matter. Was that really too much? In that moment, you thought back to childhood days when family meant safety, when a parent's embrace could fix anything, when laughter felt like belonging. Somewhere along the way, that promise had cracked. Maybe it was competition, maybe favoritism, maybe wounds never spoken aloud. Whatever the cause, it left you stranded in a crowd that was supposed to feel like your foundation. Still, despite the sting, you didn't lash out. You didn't raise your voice or demand attention. Instead, you held on to something quieter, something deeper. The knowledge that this would not define you. It would hurt, yes, but it would not break you. You were beginning to realize that sometimes the cruelest betrayals carry the seeds of transformation. That night, as the party continued around you, you stepped into a corner of the room, your eyes searching not for validation, but for clarity. And in the hush of your own thoughts, you understood. You didn't need their approval to prove your worth. What you needed was the courage to walk your own path, even if it meant walking alone. The first chapter of that realization was painful, but it was also powerful. Because in losing what you thought you needed most, you began to uncover what had been inside you all along. A voice long silenced, waiting to be heard. A strength long ignored, waiting to rise. If you lived in Mauritania, would you dare to try this tradition? Life has a way of teaching us lessons in the harshest of classrooms. And sometimes, the people we expect to shield us are the very ones who push us into the fire. But from that fire, you can emerge changed, reshaped, stronger. This was only the beginning of that journey. So as you listen now, know this. You are not alone in your hurt. You are not alone in your search for meaning. And if this story resonates with you even a little, I invite you to stay with me. A simple gesture, a quiet like or subscribe, will keep us connected. Not as a demand, but as a gentle reminder that stories like this are bridges, linking hearts that have felt the same. Because sometimes, all we need is to know that someone, somewhere, truly understands. The night carried on, though for you it felt as though time had slowed into fragments. Each conversation, each laugh, each clink of a glass seemed to echo against the hollow ache you were carrying inside. You told yourself not to take it too seriously, that perhaps it was just a misunderstanding, a careless moment, but deep down, you knew better. This wasn't a single evening's mistake. It was a reflection of something much larger, a truth that had been quietly building for years. You remember the countless times you had stood in similar places, quietly hoping that your effort would matter. School projects where your achievements were brushed aside, family gatherings where your words were drowned out, holidays where your sacrifices were forgotten. Those memories stitched themselves together, and now, under the warm lights of this celebration, they formed a tapestry of neglect too vivid to ignore. When the laughter turned louder, you slipped further into yourself. The sound of your brother's voice, joking at your expense, was not new. He had always been the loud one, the bold one, the one others admired even when his actions lacked kindness. You, on the other hand, had been steady, reliable, giving, quiet. But in a family that seemed to celebrate noise, your silence was often mistaken for weakness. What made this evening so painful wasn't just the act of your gift being cast aside, it was the way everyone else responded to it. The small chuckles, the quick dismissal, the way your mother rushed to excuse his behavior, saying you were too sensitive. That phrase, too sensitive, echoed in your mind like a judgment, as if caring deeply was a flaw, as if your heart was the problem. Isn't it strange how the people who should know us best sometimes refuse to see us at all? How a word, said lightly, can cut more deeply than silence. And how the ones who should stand with us sometimes choose convenience over compassion. I bet most people have never heard of this fact before. What about you? Have you seen it in your own life? As the night unfolded, you found yourself drifting between conversations, trying to mask your feelings with polite smiles. You watched your siblings laugh freely, their voices filling the air, while yours remained caught in your throat. You wanted to join, to belong, but every attempt felt forced, every gesture returned with half-hearted acknowledgement. The distance between you and them wasn't physical, it was something invisible, yet heavy enough to suffocate. And yet, in the quiet of your thoughts, another voice began to stir. A whisper, reminding you that your worth was not measured by their recognition. That perhaps the very pain you felt was also proof of your depth, your sincerity, your ability to love without condition. That whisper was faint, but it grew stronger each time you reminded yourself that you were more than the dismissals you endured. Still, the hurt was real. You could not deny the sting of being overlooked, of being reduced to a background character in the story of your own family. You carried their laughter like weights on your chest, pressing harder with every passing moment. But you also began to wonder, what would happen if, instead of shrinking in their shadow, you decided to step into your own light? It was a thought that scared you as much as it inspired you. After all, walking your own path would mean stepping away from the safety, however flawed, of the only circle you had ever known. Yet safety without respect is only a cage dressed as comfort. Could you really continue to live in a space where your love was undervalued and your presence taken for granted? Which fact from this video would you tell your friends right away? The more you thought about it, the clearer the answer became. You couldn't change them, at least not by waiting for their hearts to see yours. But you could change yourself. You could choose to rise above the noise, to no longer define yourself by their blindness. And maybe, just maybe, by doing so, you would show them what they had failed to recognize all along. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Plates of food were served, toasts were raised, photos were taken. On the surface, everything looked perfect, as though this gathering would be remembered as one of joy. But for you, every smile was shadowed by the truth behind it. You weren't angry anymore, you were resolved. This night had become more than just a wound. It was a turning point. And yet, even in that moment of resolve, a flicker of sadness remained. Because no matter how strong you tried to be, a part of you still longed for what should have been simple. Unconditional love, mutual respect, genuine belonging. It is one of the deepest pains, isn't it, to want so little, yet receive even less? As you looked around the room one last time, you saw not just your family, but the reflection of years gone by. You saw the birthdays where your efforts were unnoticed, the holidays where your seat at the table felt temporary, the moments where silence was your only companion. And you knew then. It wasn't that you hadn't given enough. It was that they had chosen not to see. That realization was bitter, but it was also freeing. Because once you understand that someone else's blindness is not your burden, you begin to step lighter, breathe easier. The chains of expectation loosen, and in their place grows a quiet strength. That strength would carry you forward, even as the party lights dimmed and the night drew to an end. Does anyone else find this part both shocking and fascinating like I do? You left that evening not because sometimes all it takes is one voice, one story, one listener to remind us that invisibility is not our fate. The days that followed were strangely quiet, though your heart carried the noise of that evening everywhere you went. At work, among friends, even in the solitude of your room, the memory of what had happened lingered like a shadow. You found yourself replaying each moment. The dismissive glances, the quick laughter, the way your gift was treated as though it held no value. These images returned uninvited, reminding you of a truth that was impossible to ignore. You had been invisible to those who should have known you best. Yet within that ache, something unexpected began to stir. It wasn't anger, though frustration certainly flickered. It wasn't bitterness, though disappointment pressed heavily on your chest. It was something quieter, more enduring. Resolve. A thought that whispered through the noise, telling you that if love could be withheld so easily, then maybe it was time to stop seeking it in places where it would never be freely given. Walking through the familiar streets of your neighborhood, you noticed details you had never really seen before: the way sunlight danced across old fences, the cracks in the sidewalk filled with tiny flowers, the sound of children laughing in a distant park. These small fragments of life reminded you of something you had overlooked. Beauty exists, even in silence. And maybe, just maybe, your story didn't have to be defined by the voices that had silenced you for so long. You thought back to childhood, to the days when you would dream quietly in your room, sketching out worlds where you were free to be yourself. Those dreams had never truly left you. They had only been buried under layers of expectation and neglect. Now, in the wake of that painful night, they began to resurface, calling you towards something greater. The decision wasn't clear at first. You wrestled with questions that felt heavy and unrelenting. Should you confront your family directly, demanding the respect that had been denied? Or should you walk away quietly, choosing peace over conflict? The weight of these questions settled over you like fog, and for days, you wandered through your routine without clarity. But one morning, as you stood by the window watching the sky shift from grey to pale blue, the answer came to you not as a shout, but as a whisper. You realized that waiting for change inside those walls was like waiting for a locked door to open itself. If you wanted a new story, you would have to write it yourself. Fact number 12 is totally mind-blowing. Do you agree, or is there another part that shook you more? That realization was both freeing and frightening. You knew that stepping away would not be simple. It would mean letting go of the hope that one day, they would finally see you. It would mean accepting that the recognition you craved might never come. But it would also mean something more powerful. The chance to live without constantly proving your worth to those who refused to acknowledge it. In the days that followed, you began to make small changes. You spent less time replaying old conversations and more time focusing on yourself. You picked up old hobbies you had once abandoned, finding comfort in their quiet rhythm. You allowed yourself to sit with your own thoughts, not as an enemy to be fought, but as a companion to be understood. And slowly, the heaviness inside you began to shift. Still, the pain did not disappear overnight. There were evenings when loneliness returned with sharp edges, when you longed for the simple joy of belonging. There were mornings when the thought of family gatherings still made your chest tighten. But even in those moments, you held on to the truth you had discovered. Your worth was not theirs to give or take. It had always been yours. One afternoon, you walked past a bookstore and stopped, drawn to the quiet hum of its space. You wandered through the aisles, fingertips grazing spines of novels, memoirs, collections of poetry. And as you picked up a book filled with stories of resilience, you felt something shift inside you. You realized you weren't alone in your journey. Countless others had walked paths of pain and transformation, and their words stood as proof that survival could become strength. You sat by the window that evening, book in hand, and allowed yourself to believe that perhaps your story, too, could be one of resilience. Perhaps the very moments that try to erase you could become a foundation for something greater. If you could experience only one of these truths for yourself, which number would you choose? The more you embraced this perspective, the lighter you began to feel. You no longer measured your days by how often they noticed you, but by how fully you lived them. You found laughter in unexpected places, comfort in simple routines, courage in quiet reflections. Each step forward felt uncertain, but also exhilarating, as if you were rediscovering parts of yourself long forgotten. And though your family remained unchanged, their power over you began to fade. Their words no longer cut as deeply, their silence no longer weighed as heavily. Because you had begun to understand that belonging does not always come from blood. Sometimes, it comes from the spaces you create, the people you meet, the love you give yourself. The turning point came one evening when you were invited to a gathering with friends. At first, you hesitated, afraid of feeling out of place. But as you entered the room, laughter and warmth greeted you, not as a guest on the margins, but as someone valued. For the first time in a long while, you felt what it meant to belong without having to earn it. That night, you realized something profound. Family is not only who you were born to, it is also who you choose. From that point on, you carried yourself differently. You no longer shrank when others dismissed you. You no longer questioned your worth in the face of neglect. Instead, you stood with quiet confidence, knowing that you had endured and that endurance itself was proof of your strength. Quick question: how many of these moments in your own life are related to nature, growth, or renewal? Looking back, you saw the threads that had woven your story together. The pain of neglect, the silence of invisibility, the quiet courage that grew from both. It wasn't the story you had wanted, but it was the one that shaped you. And perhaps that, in itself, was a kind of gift. The path forward remained uncertain, as all journeys do. But now, uncertainty no longer frightened you. Instead, it invited you. Because you had learned that even in the darkest moments, there are sparks waiting to be seen, sparks that can guide you toward a life defined not by absence, but by presence. And as you stepped into this new chapter, you carried with you not the weight of what had been denied, but the light of what you had found within yourself. With each passing day, you felt a shift inside yourself, subtle at first, like the gentle tilt of sunlight at dawn, but undeniable. The wounds left by that evening no longer bled as they once had. Instead, they began to form something sturdier, something almost like armor. You hadn't planned it, but resilience has a way of growing silently, weaving itself into every fiber of your being until one day you wake and realize you are no longer the same. The clarity you had found began to reshape your choices. At work, you spoke with more certainty, no longer second-guessing the worth of your ideas. With friends, you laughed more freely, allowing joy to replace the heaviness you once carried. Even in solitude, you found peace, recognizing that silence could be a sanctuary rather than a sentence. The shadows of neglect had once defined you, but now they became the backdrop against which your light stood out all the brighter. Yet despite these changes, the ache for reconciliation lingered. You wondered if your family ever replayed that night in their minds the way you did. Did they recognize the cruelty in their dismissal, or had it already faded into nothing more than another forgotten evening for them? You didn't know, and perhaps you never would. But even as questions haunted you, the answers no longer held the same power. What mattered most was not whether they saw your worth, but whether you did. One evening, while walking home under the quiet glow of street lamps, you thought about the meaning of family. Was it truly bound by blood, or was it defined by care, respect, and presence? You remember the warmth of your friends who had stood by you in moments of doubt, the mentors who had encouraged your growth, the strangers whose kindness had touched you unexpectedly. Slowly, you realized that family is not always inherited, it is also chosen. And in that realization, the loneliness that had once consumed you began to loosen its hold. Which fact in this story do you think is the most controversial? Still, the journey was not without its struggles. There were mornings when the memory of being overlooked returned unbidden, tugging at your chest with quiet sorrow. There were gatherings you skipped, not because you didn't care, but because you had learned that self-preservation sometimes means choosing distance. And there were nights when you longed for the impossible, for things to be different, for words of apology that might never come. But alongside the sorrow was something else. Acceptance. Not the kind that surrenders, but the kind that acknowledges reality while still choosing to rise above it. You accepted that your family might never change, and in that acceptance, you found freedom. Because once you stopped waiting for them to rewrite your story, you realized the pen had always been in your hands. Your growth did not go unnoticed. Friends remarked on your newfound confidence, colleagues leaned on your wisdom, and even strangers sensed the calm strength in your presence. You hadn't sought recognition, yet it came naturally once you stopped chasing it. Ironically, the very thing your family had withheld became abundant in other places, not because the world had changed, but because you had. One afternoon, months after that fateful evening, you found yourself passing the same house where the celebration had taken place. The windows glowed warmly, voices floated into the night, and for a moment, old memories threatened to rise. But instead of bitterness, you felt a quiet calm. You no longer stood outside those walls longing to be welcomed. You now understood that your place in the world wasn't dependent on that table. You had built your own. And perhaps, in some distant way, your family had noticed the difference. You heard it in small remarks, in the way silence lingered longer after your absence, in the subtle attempts to draw you back. But you didn't rush. you knew that true reconciliation could not be built on fragile apologies, it had to be rooted in change. Until then, you carried no resentment, only boundaries. If you had the chance to witness one truth with your own eyes, would you take it? The transformation you experienced was not sudden. It was shaped by countless small choices. Each time you chose self-respect over self-doubt, each time you chose courage over silence, each time you chose to build rather than break. Piece by piece, you stitched together a life that was no longer defined by their neglect, but by your own determination. In those choices, you discovered something profound. Sometimes the greatest victories are not loud, but quiet. They are not won in grand confrontations, but in the silent moments when you refuse to give up on yourself. And perhaps that is what makes them lasting. They are built from within, untouchable by anyone else's blindness. There will always be those who fail to see us, who minimize our worth, who dismiss our efforts. But there will also always be the possibility to rise, to grow, to redefine the story. And once you choose to live by that possibility, the past loses its power to imprison you. The truth is, pain does not vanish, it transforms. The ache of being overlooked remains, but it becomes a reminder of how far you've come. It teaches you empathy, resilience, and the ability to see in others what was once denied to you. And in that, your story extends beyond yourself. It becomes a bridge for anyone who has ever felt invisible, a whisper of hope that invisibility is not the end. After hearing this part, what single word would you use to describe how it made you feel? As you stand now, looking back on all that has unfolded, you understand something you didn't before. Sometimes the most painful endings are not endings at all, but beginnings in disguise. That night, which once felt like the breaking of everything, became the very ground on which you built a stronger, freer version of yourself. And while the scars remain, they no longer define you. They remind you. For in the end, your story is not one of defeat, but of emergence. Not of being cast aside, but of rising. Not of silence, but of a voice reclaimed. And though the journey was carved from pain, it carries with it a beauty that could never have been born any other way. Looking back now, you realize that the night which once felt like an ending was truly a doorway. Through the cracks of disappointment, light found its way in, guiding you toward a version of yourself that no longer seeks permission to exist. The silence that once haunted you has become a reminder of your strength, and the absence of recognition has taught you to honor your own worth.